Chapter 19. I've got to open my eyes. I've got to, Matt was thinking frantically as he tried to find the courage to face the enemy. He had only been standing like that for an instant when he heard Katie call his name. On opening his eyes, he saw one of the grenadiers about to charge Hooter with a sword. Hoot, look out! Matt yelled as he reached for a big stick that was on the ground. He threw it at the soldier but missed him, hitting Hooter instead. Tony and Q knelt down beside Hooter as he lay moaning on the ground. The soldiers waved their swords and shouted until Matt and the boys put their hands over their heads. We give up, Matt cried. We give up. The Hessians seemed to understand and accept their surrender. Sorry, Hoot, Matt whispered as Hooter stood beside him holding his hand over the cut on his head. The soldiers motioned for everyone to form a line, but Katie ran to Matt and wouldn't let go of his leg. One of the soldiers, a man with bright red hair and mustache, yelled something in German at her, but she wouldn't leave Matt's side. The soldier left his sword and growled. Katie began to sob, but didn't budge. The soldier took a step toward them. Suddenly, one of the other soldiers reached out and grabbed his comrade's arm. He spoke in a low, calm voice. The red-headed soldier lowered his sword and backed away. Katie's sobs had quieted down to a whimper. The other Hessian came over to them and patted Katie on the head. Then he turned to Matt and asked, who? Das Katie. Her name is Katie, Matt said. Katie, yeah, das Katie. The soldier looked down at Katie and grinned. Then he walked over to Hooter, who stood holding his head. There was a short gash on Hooter's forehead and was bleeding down the side of his face. The soldier pulled a rag from his pocket and offered it to him. Das who? He looked at Hooter. Hooter. Hooter replied as he put the rag on his forehead. The soldier laughed. Hoot, hoot, he repeated. When Hooter lifted the rag, his cut was still bleeding. He turned to the soldier. If you don't mind, he said, that is, if it would be okay with you, could I just put a little Band-Aid on it? Where are you going to get a Band-Aid? Q whispered. Right here, Hooter whispered back, slowly putting his hand in his pocket. The soldier shouted out on seeing him reach into his pocket and poked him with the musket. Hooter quickly pulled out the Band-Aid and held it up in his trembling fingers. The soldiers gathered around him as he opened the wrapper. It's okay, Hooter assured them. It's just a Band-Aid. He pulled the end tabs off the Band-Aid and placed it over his cut. The soldiers took turns running their fingers over the smooth plastic surface. They shook their heads, bewildered at the strange material that stuck by itself to Hooter's forehead. Everyone suddenly looked up at the sound of an approaching deer. It was a large buck that had come to the creek for a drink. Once it had picked up their scent, however, it bolted over some low bushes and ran off into the forest. The soldiers decided to try and follow the deer, since they hadn't eaten meat in many days. It was agreed that two of the soldiers would go after the deer while the remaining soldier would take the children back to camp. Matt was glad that the end had been left with the red-headed soldier, for he had looked mean. This soldier seemed much kinder. He had them march in a single file, though he allowed Katie to walk at Matt's side. He even let them talk amongst themselves when they stopped to rest. They knew that he couldn't understand English and so were able to talk freely in front of him. It was a slow march through the woods, and they stopped several times to rest as the day wore on. At least we're all together finally, Matt sighed when they had come to another stop. Yeah, great, Tony whispered, and now we can all die together. I want Mommy, Maddie-O, Katie cried. On hearing this, she clutched Matt's leg. It's okay, Katie, no one is going to die, Matt whispered. He turned around to face Tony. No one in this club is going to die. Do you understand? I'm going to get us out of this. I promise. How are you going to get us back home? Back to the 20th century? Tony wanted to know. The rowboat, Q said. If we find the rowboat, maybe we can get back home. Maybe? Matt asked, turning to Q. I'm afraid it's only a maybe, Q told him. Adam Hibbs said his grandfather had traveled through many different time periods in the old rowboat before he found this one. Wow, Matt whispered. Well, I guess this seemed like such a fantastic story that no one but his grandson believed him, Q added. But did Adam Hibbs ever try to get back to his own time? Matt wanted to know. No, he decided to stay in this one, Q replied. Why? Tony asked. From what Adam said, the young Adam That is, his grandmother was very pretty. He said that his grandfather took one look at her and decided that the 1700s would be as good a time as any to call home. Oh, yuck, Tony said, making a face. After he decided to stay in this time, Q continued, he hid the boat, but someone else must have found it because it disappeared and he never saw it again. He told his grandson the whole story, and the young Adam had been looking out for the old boat ever since he was a boy. But, Q, did he tell you how his grandfather knew where the boat would take him? Did he have any control over what time he could travel to? Matt asked. Q shook his head. He was getting to that, but his voice got so low, I just couldn't make out the words. Something about the mind. It was the last thing that he was trying to tell me before he closed his eyes and, well, stopped talking, Q said, looking away. Oh, great, Matt moaned. Now we just have to find the rowboat and take our chances. What do you mean, take our chances? Hooter wanted to know. He means maybe we'll get back to our time and maybe we won't, Tony told him. And if we don't, there's no telling where we'll end up, Q said. I want to go home, Katie cried. I want Mommy. Shh, Katie, don't worry, Matt said, bending down to hug her. I'm here with you, and we'll find a way to get back home to Mom and Dad. Really, we will. He looked up to see the worried faces of Tony, Hooter, and Q. We'll do it, we will, he tried to assure them. But first we have to get ourselves away from these Hessians and back with the American army, he whispered. Where are they? Hooter wanted to know. All I see is trees and more trees. And even if we did know where the rebels were, how are we supposed to get to them? He hasn't let go of that musket since we started, Tony said, nodding to the Hessian. As he looked over at the soldier, Matt tried to guess his age. If you took the way away the mustache, he thought to himself, he wouldn't look much older than Israel. Matt couldn't get the young soldier out of his mind. Why do you suppose the Hessians came all the way over here from Germany to fight in a war they didn't know anything about? He whispered to Q. Well, King George was running out of British troops to send over to America, so he paid the Germans to send some of their troops, Q told him. Do you think they're really as bloodthirsty as the rebels say? Matt asked. I don't know, Q answered. I suppose some are and some aren't, but by the looks of this one, I'd say they're a lot like any other soldier. They're just trained differently. I remember reading about it for our report. Actually, many of their soldiers were young boys who lived on farms and needed the money or wanted to become somebody special. Like a Marine? Hooter asked. I guess you could say they were like Marines, Q nodded. I wouldn't mind being a Marine and protecting my country, Hooter said, as long as I wouldn't have to hurt anybody. I don't think it works like that, Hoot. Matt smiled, but he knew what Hooter meant. Suddenly, the soldier sighed loudly and pulled up his pant leg just above the boot line. He had walked through some thorny bushes, and his leg was beginning to bleed. Hooter reached into his pocket and pulled out the biggest band-aid he had. He always carried band-aids in case he met someone who needed one, and he always carried 3 different sizes. Excuse me, sir, he said loudly. Would you like a band-aid? He waved it to the air in front of the soldier. Band-aid, band-aid, he said. He waited to see the soldier's response, and when the Hessian beckoned him forward, Hooter stood up. He went up to the soldier and opened the band-aid and carefully placed it over the bloodiest part of the wound. The leg was pretty badly scratched, but the band-aid was able to stop the severest bleeding. The soldier stared at the band-aid for a long time and pulled at the edges, feeling the sticky underside. Then he looked at Hooter. Bandad. Hoot. He smiled at Hooter and then tapped himself in the chest. It had been Gustav. Gustav. That's great, Hooter grinned. Hi, Gustav. Nice to meet you. Yeah, Hoot. The soldier grinned back. Then he stood up and had them form into a line again. Hooter, we aren't at a tea party, Matt said sternly as they began to make their way through the woods. We're not supposed to be making friends with them. That's the enemy. He nodded wearily back at the soldier. They continued the march in silence until the sounds of rushing water filled their ears. As they came into a clearing, they found themselves suddenly standing in the banks of the Delaware. It's the river, Matt whispered. This is probably our best chance to meet up with the army. He turned around to look at Gustav. The soldier had a confused look on his face, as if he were lost. He pointed his musket down to the shoreline and mumbled something in German. The weary prisoners trudged on down to the shore and walked along the water's edge. They had only walked a few yards when they came upon a fat beaver building a dam. The beaver was off to the left side of the shore, and was so intent on his work that he took no notice of the group. Even Gustav seemed to be interested as they all stopped to observe the industrious animal. Katy stood beside Matt, but her attention was diverted to a family of wild ducks that were floating on the river. She took a few steps in their direction. As everyone was preoccupied with watching the beaver, they failed to see Katy moving closer to the river's edge. When she spotted a baby duck in the group, she stepped further out and onto the ice, hoping to get a better look. Help! Katy cried suddenly as the thin ice cracked and her left leg disappeared into a hole. Before Matt could move, he saw that Gustav was up and running to the edge of the ice. Don't move, Matt called out to Katy, who was struggling to free her leg. He and the rest of the boys had rushed over and were now gathered along the shore watching. As Gustav bravely made his way into the thin ice, Matt knew that if the ice cracked and Gustav fell through, he would surely die. But the Hessian soldier didn't hesitate for a moment. His eyes were riveted to each step he took, knowing full well that the next step could be his last. When he reached Katy, he pulled her leg free and quickly carried her off the ice that shuddered and cracked beneath his feet. It was the bravest thing that Matt had ever seen anyone do. Once they had reached solid ground, Gustav put Katy down and ran crying to Matt. Katy, Matt scolded as he picked her up. You managed to get yourself in more trouble than the whole club put together. You could have drowned. Matt looked over guiltily at the Hessian soldier. He felt bad about his earlier remark, referring to Gustav as the enemy. He knew he should thank him for saving Katy's life, but he was too embarrassed to go up to him, though Hooter was not. Thanks, Gustav, Hooter cried, holding his hand out to the soldier. Gustav smiled and shook Hooter's hand. That was a really brave, but Hooter's voice was suddenly silenced by the sound of musket fire. He and the rest of the club looked on in horror as Gustav cried out in pain, for a musket ball had ripped through his back. He took a step, then fell forward, toppling to the ground with his face in the snow. Cease your fire, the rest are just children, came a loud voice. Matt and the others stood staring wide-eyed as a group of rebel soldiers came out of the woods. A skinny-looking corporal went up to Gustav and poked him hard with his musket. I don't think this Hessian will be causing us more trouble now, he called back to his comrades with a grin. You see, boys, he continued, here is one Hessian you can trust.